introduce the next person, who is Professor Shariff, Professor Azim Shariff. That I met him in a very interesting way, which is that I was invited to be part. Well, he and I were invited to be part of what's called a heterodox conversation. There is a place called the Heterodox, or an entity called the Heterodox Academy, based out of academia, that really tries to encourage conversations from very different viewpoints. And so we were both invited to talk about DI, presumably from two opposing viewpoints. We found out that actually in reality our views were very highly aligned. And one of the things that I really appreciated about his work was the fact that he presented some work that kind of cast some questions using data and research as to whether some of the justifications that are given for DI in academia, and especially the way that academia does it, are actually justified. And so I was so fascinated with his work that I asked him if he would kindly present some of his work here. So I'm delighted to have Azim join us today, and all the way from Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll let you go ahead and take the stage. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Paulo, and thank you for inviting me. I want to present some slides with this. Let me just make sure I can do that. Here we go.
And make sure, there you go, perfect.
Can you guys see that? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
And hopefully you're seeing my actual slides rather than my presenter notes here. Thank you again for inviting me. Yeah, it was one of those annoying debates. It wasn't really a debate because it was one of those things where both speakers agreed much more than they disagreed. I did a second one of those conversations and the same thing happened. And that leads me to think that most people who are talking about this topic are fair, reasonable people. And then you have a fringe of people who have very vocal opinions, which might be less reasonable. Anyways, I wanted to start in the same way that Farah started, which is just talking a bit about my own background, because it's what led me to really question this. This is not my main area of research. I study morality, I study religion, but diversity is something which has captured my attention since I took my position at UBC. Before that, I was a part of the University of California system. And I was lured back to Canada. I'm from Canada as part of this Canada 150 Research Chairs program. Canada was celebrating its 150th birthday. They sponsored half dozen research chairs across the country, and departments all around the country competed to be able to get one of those slots. The reason I'm bringing it up is because there was in the job description, they said that there was preference that was given to people who were members of any of four categories. And those categories were women, Indigenous persons, people with disabilities, and then racialized minorities. And in Canada, South Asians would count as one of, like myself, would count as one of that last group, the racialized minorities. And so the department I now belong to, which is the psychology department at UBC, being the shrewd operators that they were, figured that if they're competing with multiple other departments and there's preference that's given to one of these four categories, they were only going to nominate people who were a member of those categories. And that turned out to be a good strategy. They nominated me. I eventually got the position. It ended up good for them. It ended up very good for me because I got to come back to Vancouver, which is where I'm from, where my family is. Those of you who've had experience working in academia know that it's a pretty rare blessing to be able to go back to where you're from. You don't have that much geographic flexibility in choosing where you become a professor. So that was great. But being hired under those circumstances left me knowing that I was hired under a different set of criteria than my colleagues were. It wasn't only because of my research and teaching expertise or promise that I was hired, but it was also due to these other characteristics, being a member of one of these four groups. And I knew that all my colleagues knew that as well, that I was hired for slightly different criteria than they were. It wasn't entirely on these other measurable metrics that we tend to use in academia. And it also left my department, when they were choosing whom to nominate, it left them with a smaller pool to choose from. Now, those are costs. They're costs to using this type of hiring strategy. It's not to say that it's a problem, because the benefits that might bring might outweigh those costs, in which case it wouldn't be a problem at all. It would be a wise decision among trade-offs. The problem is those benefits were never made clear to me. It was never made clear to me exactly why it was that we were selecting those groups or what I was expected to do as being a member of those. And that's the motivation. That's the reason that I want to talk about this question right now, which is diversity for what? What was the point of actually giving priority, giving preference to those members of those groups, including myself. So I've been in my career on a number of search committees, and in academia, it's very clear throughout, diversity is a huge priority in faculty hiring. And we all talk about it, and we all end up reasonably on the same page about that. But what's often not discussed, again, is that question about why. What diversity for what? What is the point of the diversity? And the problem with not talking about those rationales is that though we are in principle all on the same page about diversity, when it comes to concrete questions about whom to hire, we ended up with questions like, well, is it better to hire the white person who studies a topic related to diversity or to prejudice or discrimination? Or is it better to hire a minority candidate who doesn't? Or does an Asian person count as diverse? Does a woman count as diverse in a field where women are overrepresented? What about social class? What about viewpoint diversity? And so now all of a sudden, all these people who were previously on the same page at an abstract level about diversity find that they actually aren't on the same page at all. And in a way, this is like the opposite of the Indian parable of the blind man and the elephant. Instead of everybody feeling the same animal, thinking it's different, everybody's feeling a different animal and kind of thinking it's the same. And so it comes back to that question. It was raised in the last session and in the session with Julie, I think, raised this question about what is diversity? What do we mean when we talk about diversity? In order to think carefully about that, I think it's important to clarify what diversity is not. So some of you may be familiar with the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He has this very famous essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. And he has this great paragraph in it where he talks about what liberty is and what's not. And he starts off the paragraph by saying, everything is what it is. And he proceeds to distinguish liberty from these closely related concepts, often conflated concepts, which aren't actually liberty at all. And I think we can do the same thing for diversity. So I think diversity is diversity. It's not fairness or equality or justice, and it's not academic excellence, it's not innovativeness, it's not strength. It may lead to those things, but that relationship needs to be demonstrated rather than just asserted, let alone just conflated. So what then is diversity? Humans differ on all sorts of characteristics, right? So we differ on race and gender and socioeconomic status. We differ on blood type, and we differ on birthdays and basketball ability. We differ on personality and passions and political preferences. But only some of these factors are the ones that we care about when we are pursuing our diversity goals, when we are, say, hiring faculty at university. But which ones we care about, that depends entirely on those questions of our rationales for why diversity is important. So what type of diversity we care about depends on why we care about diversity. And so why is it something that we tend not to talk about on these search committees or to the candidates that we're hiring? The psychologist in me says that one of the reasons is because of this thing that we call in psychology a sacred value. We have a sort of a formal definition for this in psychology. I know it's a colloquial term, but when we study it in psychology, there's a few features that sacred values tend to have. So one is that they tend to be these emotionally charged issues of moral or ethical importance. Protecting them tends to be tied to personal or group identities. So you have a personal stake in protecting that value. They tend to be non-negotiable and resistant to compromise or trade-offs, which makes it difficult to talk about, difficult to argue about in particular. And even raising questions about them is often met with outrage. Again, something that makes it hard to talk about. An even more mundane reason for why we don't talk about it is that people might think, well, why bother? We all recognize that this is something valuable. The value of this is obvious. It's common sense. We don't need to actually go back and talk about why it is that we value diversity to begin with. We've had those conversations. Now, for me as an academic and as a social scientist, I'm in the business of interrogating what seems like common sense and of questioning things that are unquestioned and of resisting the worship of sacred cows. And not doing so in the case of diversity would be failing to live up to the principles that we hold for every other question. And I don't think we want to have diversity supported in a different way than we support other characteristics. I don't think we want to leave this as an unquestioned value. And there are practical reasons to talk about it as well. So here are four that I've thought about. Because it's not as if people don't actually have rationales. They do have the rationales. It's just that they're implicit rationales that we don't often talk about in the open. Sometimes we don't even think about them. So one is that people tend to misunderstand each other. I give you those examples of the search committees that I've been on. If one person thinks we're pursuing diversity for one reason, and another thinks we're pursuing it for a different reason, well, then these people are going to be pursuing different strategies and not even understanding why the other person is pursuing that strategy. Why are you caring about that if the reason for diversity is, well, the reason that I'm holding implicitly in my head? You have to realize that other people are holding it in their head, different ones in their heads as well. And that getting on the same page actually makes us more effective decision makers. By the way, I realized listening to the previous talks that if there's any group that probably has done the thinking about these diversity rationales, it's probably this particular group. So maybe what's actually instructive about this talk is telling you how academics tend to think about this group, or how it is that you could maybe break down these conversations to the partners and clients that you end up working with. A second reason for why I think it's worth making that implicit rationales about diversity explicit is that if we're solely focusing on diversity, we may achieve diversity but not achieve the actual goals that motivated our pursuit of diversity. So if the issue people care about is something like hiring bias, we may solve the diversity issue without solving the hiring bias. And those original problems may persist unaddressed, even though we've hit our metric for diversity. So we don't want to get overly seduced by just these kind of superficial metrics when they're underlying problems that we care about more. A third point, and this is maybe a bit of an airy-fairy point here, a more academic philosophical point, because this is one that's attributed to John Stuart Mill, who I could say is maybe the patron saint of that Heterodox Academy organization that Paulo talked about. So he made the argument that if we transmit these principles without periodically revisiting our explanations for them, our reasons for holding them, then the fear is that they turn into these superstitions, these what he calls dead dogmas, where we lose the institutional or even personal memory of why we were pursuing these in the first place. And things go not just from being unquestioned, but they go to being unanswerable. And the problem with that, there are many problems with that, but one problem is that when then people come to attack us on them, as many have talked about is happening now with DEI in general, we don't have the explanations to go back and say, well, no, this is why it's important. Again, that session that we had, the panel on should we pay attention to the research and data? Well, they dealt with this question. When your clients come to you and tell you, well, why should I care about this? You want to have the answers. And then the fourth is that our organizations, certainly not universities, they don't operate in a vacuum. Universities, we fancy ourselves in this ivory tower that kind of floats above the fray, but we very much rest on the support and the beneficence of the societies and the communities that we're embedded in. We require not just the buy-in of the people who are sending us their students or the students themselves, but we require the trust of the larger community that kind of invests in us as well. And some of you may be aware that that trust in higher ed, in institutions across the board, but in particularly in higher ed, has been on a bit of a slide over the last 10 years. So here you can see here, across 30 years, the average trust in institutions has fallen about 10 points, but the trust in higher ed has fallen 20 points in about 10 years. It's still pretty high relative to other institutions, which is good, but very rarely do you see the trust in any institution fall this sharply, this quickly. So in order to earn some of that trust back, or at least to backstop it from falling further, I think universities and probably other organizations need to be seen to be based on justifiable principles rather than just on inexplicable maxims or on dead dogma. Now, you may quibble with any one of these reasons. I don't think you need to believe them all, I think even believing one of them is a sufficient reason to justify a more in-depth conversation about diversity rationales. So let's get into that, if you will bear with me here. In the diversity literature, and again, I'm speaking to the group that's probably most familiar with this, diversity rationales have generally been bifurcated into two kind of categories of rationales. So first, they're justice rationales, and these focus on the moral case for correcting inequities caused by past injustices. These were the original justifications for pursuing diversity. These are the ones that came up out of the civil rights movements in the US and elsewhere. And for the first few years of the movement for diversity, these were the ones that predominated. But for various historical reasons, including some pivotal Supreme Court rulings during the 70s and 80s and 90s, and now I guess in the 2020s, the justice rationales have somewhat been crowded out by the other category, which is instrumental rationales. And these focus on the utilitarian benefits that diversity can bring in terms of improved performance or creativity, a cognitive division of labor, maybe understanding your customers more, reaching a broader customer base. So I saw, again, in that one session, which I really enjoyed about paying attention to data and research, the reasons that were given for why we should pay attention to diversity, they were all in this instrumental rationales category rather than in the justice rationales category. Even though it might be the justice rationale category that most of us are actually motivated by, it might be that people recognize that the instrumental rationales are the ones that are more saleable to companies that are forking out the cash. Now, this distinction, I think, is useful, but I think it's incomplete. It fails to capture some of the complexity and the multiplicity of rationales that actually does exist. So for one, these broad categories, they lack the granularity of recognizing that even within, say, justice rationales, there's multiple justice rationales. And in instrumental rationales, as I rattled off, there's multiple different reasons, utilitarian benefits for diversity that you could be pursuing. And you could be pursuing some to the exclusion of others. They imply different strategies. So it's important to know specifically which type of justice rationale or which type of instrumental rationale is the one that's actually motivating you. Second, there are some rationales that blur the distinction between these. So in academia, one of those would be role modeling of students. I think there you have an area where having a greater diversity among the faculty improves teaching. That makes it an instrumental rationale, but in particular improves teaching for the minority students who may have been underserved in the past, which means that it puts it in the category of justice rationale. So it can be both. And then finally, it misses the fact that there are specific rationales for specific industries. So different professions might benefit from their own unique type of rationales. So I'll give you an example. In the military, there's a particular structure and particular life and death stakes that you have people who are going into combat in a very hierarchically organized unit. In that case, there's big costs to cohesion and morale of having a highly diverse base of subordinates who are being commanded by a brass which is not diverse. And it's potentially for that reason. In fact, that was listed in the Supreme Court case that was talked about in the previous session as one of the reasons there's a exception made for military academies. They recognize that there's this alternative rationale for diversity that applies specifically to that profession. Similarly, in the police, they rely a lot on community trust. And so having a police force that better reflects the community, is representative of what the community looks like, can also have benefits that you don't see in other professions. Now, you guys deal with a whole bunch of different types of organizations. For my project, I was focused specifically on the types of rationales that we care about for academia. Some of these are going to be rationales that will be universal. They're rationales across organizations, and some of them are ones that are particular to academia. So I'm going to show you here. This is the taxonomy I put together. I've done tons of reading on this stuff, and these are what I've found to be the 10 most common diversity rationales within my field of academia. Now, there may be others, and some of these may overlap a little too much, but I think that this actually has most of it. And I think this is a pretty good list. So I think this is a good list to jog conversation, certainly in the academy and potentially outside of it as well. Now, I think as you're looking at all of these, I think you realize we could probably have a half-hour discussion about each of these, but then this talk would be 5 hours long, and I have 9 minutes left. So instead, what I'm going to offer is you guys can email me if you want the paper I've written on this. By the way, you can also use these QR codes, which will, in fact, write the email for you to me. I can give you the paper where I go through all of these in more detail. I distinguish them from each other. I explain what they are. And for the ones where it's relevant, I present a snapshot of what the evidence in the social sciences looks for how well diversity actually achieves these. Because that was one of the more surprising parts of the project that I went through. I thought that based on what I'd read previously at a surface level, some of these would have much stronger evidentiary support than they actually do. So three in particular that I found that I expected to find very strong evidence for, but did not, is number 4 here. The idea that diversity improves team creativity and performance. There's an enormous body of literature on this. Many, many meta-analyses. The latest meta-analysis I read had over 600 studies, which it crunched together and found that on average, the amount of variance in team creativity and performance that's explained by diversity is under 1%. So it's not a strong effect, just looking at overall. There are particular areas in which it may be more important than others, but overall, it's not a huge effect. Similarly, the ones where I expected to see the strongest evidence for were in the role modeling categories, improving learning outcomes and improving these non-learning outcomes, which is a grab bag for different things which having a diverse faculty could afford to members of minority communities. The evidence is not there. It's not as strong as I thought it would be. There are small effects, but they're inconsistent. You do see stronger effects for K through 12. Once you get to the college level, the effects that I've seen digging into this literature are, as I said, they're modest. So I think we talked about the importance of research and data. I think it's also important to update our attitudes and beliefs based on that research and data. I have enough time, so what I'm also going to talk about now is I did a survey of department chairs. These are decision makers in academic hiring. Faculty are hired by other faculty, but oftentimes the department chair has an outsized role in that. And department chairs tend to be people who have been faculty members for a long time, so they've had their hand in many searches. So I did a survey of just over 300 department chairs across Canada, the US, and the UK, and across about 15 different disciplines in the arts and humanities, in the social sciences, and in STEM fields. And I was asking them to indicate I gave them the list of 10 rationales, and I was asking them which of these actually explains your motivations for faculty diversity most strongly. I also asked them about general diversity policies at their departments. So this was, as I mentioned, yeah, it's all these. One of the things that was notable that I alluded to at the beginning was that virtually all of them indicated that diversity was a factor in their hiring. Everybody talks about it. What's notable is that although 24%, so about a quarter, said that we don't sufficiently factor it in. It's not factored in enough. Many more, about half the sample said, okay, even if we do factor it in enough, we don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about why. We don't go through the rationales and the explanations for it enough. So I do think there is a space for this conversation. Okay, I'm first going to show you what forms of diversity people prioritize. The department chair said were prioritized in their faculty hiring. And this gives some data to the question that was brought up before about what types of diversity do people tend to care about. So yeah, it was Julie who said in a previous session that people default first to race and ethnicity, and that's reflected in these data. And then they talk about gender, also reflected in these data. But indigeneity is one that's talked about in academia, especially in in Canada. This was strongest in Canada. We care a lot about this issue. But socioeconomic class was also pretty high. You see disabilities up there too, and then you see them decline thereafter. So there are different types of diversity that are prioritized, and they're also prioritized for different reasons. So here now I'm going to show you the different rationales and how strongly those were considered motivations for hiring. So here what you see is that among the rationales that I talked about, this hidden merit category, which is that we care about diversity because diversity would be an outcome if we were engaging in fair hiring practices. If we were really trying to hire the best people, however defined, without falling to our prejudices or without falling to systematic disadvantages which might underpredict how promising somebody is going to be on traditional metrics of academic success. Well, those are the ones that seem to be motivating people the most. Then you see the learning and non-learning outcomes, the role modeling ones. Then you see the heterodoxy ones, signaling. And then you see the social justice ones there at the bottom, potentially for some of those legal reasons that we kind of alluded to before about the Supreme Court decisions. All right, so I would encourage you guys, or if you're having these conversations with your clients or different companies, to actually have this conversation about what the rationales are behind the pursuits of diversity in their particular organizations. You don't have to use my list. As I noted, several of these are going to be applicable across the board. Several are specific to academia, and even those within academia might quibble with my list. But I would encourage you to use some sort of list to get an understanding of what people actually care about when they are pursuing diversity, for all of those reasons that I talked about before. Obviously, not everybody is comfortable talking about rationales for diversity, otherwise we would do it more. But I think a lot of that discomfort comes from the fact that, well, just nobody else is actually talking about this. A lot of people are just waiting for an invitation or for permission to talk about these rationales. And I think we should give it to them. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you, people. Oh, this was great. Azim, I'm delighted to have invited you. I think this was really great. Really enjoy the research that you're doing, and I look forward to some opportunities to exchange more ideas about it. And I hope that people appreciate it. Just getting, speaking of diversity, the range of both topics that we've been covering and the people that we've been talking about as well. Oh, I see we're being asked to start the video. Sorry, I guess you could hear me, but not see me. There. Now hopefully you can see me as well. But anyway, so thank you. I really, really appreciate it. Look forward. And by the way, you were going to publish a paper about this. Is that paper been published or is it in the works?
It's under review now. We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. Well, I'm optimistic that it deserves to see the light of day. And I hope you submitted it also to the heterodox meeting for next year in New York. I'm planning to be there. I'm submitting something as well, a little bit different, but great. Well, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time. And also clearly you said it on some of the other sessions. And I know that especially you being 3 hours behind, I know that means that you've been donating a lot of your time to us. And I really appreciate that. And we have 1 or 2 minutes, but why don't we go ahead and get started? And in fact, I can hear my computer beeping over there. So thank you again, Azim.